Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I actually live in Florida. I'm glad to get here to Oklahoma and get cooled off. It's cold weather for me. Most of you have no idea who I am. Brian and about two other people, I think, and I pay them a lot of money to say good things about me. And the thing I always tell my students is, beware of the person who's always asked to speak after lunch. So those of you pastors who ever get invited to a preaching convention and you get the afternoon slot, you'll know how valued your preaching is. And we'll go from there. But anyway, so I've got some slides I want to show from time to time, but unfortunately the computer is way up there. So I may from time to time mess up on the slides, so we'll go from there. But one of the things I always like to tell people, my wife says, give them a little of your background because when you do, maybe they'll be more compassionate toward you and be more tolerant as time goes on. So I do that as we go. I actually was born in Toledo, Ohio, and my grandmother liked to remind me I came from good Welsh Midwestern stock. But when I was quite young, my parents relocated us to Miami, where I grew up on a block of transplanted New York City Italian Catholics. We were the only Protestants on the block. So if you pick up a New York City accent, that's exactly where I got it, was Miami. Figure that out. I brought some home shots from my hometown. You can't tell if that's a sunrise or a sunset, depends on where you are. We used to race cigarette boats out in the ocean. I was on a surfing team, and of course my beloved Miami Dolphins, whose motto is, next year. It's depressing, friends, I'm telling you. Now I can go a long way into my background, but basically I like to tell people I grew up in a church. But it wasn't until I went to college that anybody talked to me about having a personal faith in Jesus Christ. So I grew up in a very traditional church. Unfortunately, it wasn't like Oklahoma churches. It was a church in which I rarely heard Jesus' name invoked. I heard his name quite a bit on the golf course, but I can assure you that was a very different context altogether. So it wasn't until I went to college that anybody ever talked about having a personal faith in Jesus Christ. I still remember to this day the first time a guy talked about Christianity like that. And I tell people, my parents dedicated me to God when I was an infant, but I gave my heart to Jesus as a disciple March 6, 1971, room 211 of Hume Hall at the University of Florida. A moment of silence for that great institution. Now, I'm not feeling the Methodist love in the room right now. Yeah, right. Do I hear an amen for the thunder? That's right, there you go. Okay, we can all agree on that, you know. Start talking about that oblong football and you'll be in trouble. After seminary, after college, I went to seminary and got involved in a very traditional but non-denominational church. I mean, it was traditional, had more stained glass than most Catholic churches would have. And at the traditional Wednesday night prayer meeting, the dear church members would gather together and they would beseech the Lord. And they would say, Lord, send us the young people. We want to see young people become disciples of Jesus. And I still remember we met in the basement of that church. There were about 30 high school students at the time. And we asked them, what's going to take for you to bring your friends to this church? And they told us. And we did one of the most innovative things that you could ever do. We actually did what they told us to do. What a concept that is. And over the course then of the next 2 years, we saw that student ministry go from 30 to 60 to 100 to 300 to 600 to 1,200 high school students now coming 2 different nights of the week because the sanctuary only held 700 people. Well, then the dear church members at the Wednesday night prayer meeting, they got fervent in their prayers and prayed, Lord, take away these young people. And I'm deliberately toning down that fervency. At that point in time, we started doing these quarterly parents' nights, and the parents would come up, they'd sit up in the balcony and come down afterwards and go, man, this is great. This is like what happens on Sunday morning in the church. And we'd say, no, stay away from Sunday morning. You want no part of Sunday morning. But it gave us an idea, and we went to the pastor and said, could we start a second service that would reach out to the parents of these high school students? Well, in 2013, when I talked to church planters, in fact, I was in Dallas yesterday with jurisdictional training of 40 multi-site pastors. And today when you talk about a multi-site or an extra service or, extension campuses, people fall asleep. But in 1974, the idea of having more than one service in a church was anathema. That's just not the way the ecclesiology of the church did back then. So unfortunately for us, and fortunately for us, this pastor was ignorant, and we started a second service. And in 6 weeks, we had 700 new people come into that service. At that point in time, the dear members at the Wednesday night prayer meeting, they stopped praying altogether. Let's see, that was 1975, it's 2013. That was a long time ago. And I've been in a lot of churches working since that time, but I've yet to be in a church where I experienced the level of bitterness, animosity, anger, strife, envy, just keep on with the synonyms, as I experienced in that church when all those new people started coming. Well, as a young man at the time, that was a little confusing for me, just starting out in ministry, because I've been raised in a church that prided itself on keeping God out of the equation. Now I was in a church that had all the right teachings about Jesus and God. They had stuff plastered all over the walls. And yet neither of these churches could detect the work of the Holy Spirit under their own nose. That's a little confusing when you're just starting out in ministry. And the level of animosity got so bad in that church that finally the director of our students just said, this is just not God honoring. So we went to the deacon board of that church and said, could we take the Thursday night high school group, move down the road, and start a church with them? And to their credit, they gave us their blessing and said, sayonara. We went down 20 miles down the road, we rented a movie theater and started a church with 600 high school students. Now, that's the best way to do anything, really, is with 600 high school students, because they know one speed and one direction. And we told them the opening Sunday, just bring one of your parents to the grand opening. At the end of the first year, we had 1,000 people coming. At the end of the second year, we had 3,000 coming, and I know today they're running 22,000 on the weekends. I directed the student ministry there for the first 3 years, and I'm probably the only person on this side of the planet that ever got bored starting Willow Creek Community Church and left. Because for me, once you got it up and running, what else was there to do? So I moved back to Florida, and my ministry was to start new churches. I'd basically parachute drop into an area, knock on doors, gather people together and start a church. I didn't have any church members I inherited. I didn't have anything. It was nobody. I did that over the next 21 years. I did that on 6 different occasions. At that point in time, I didn't really know what the next chapter was going to do, but I started having all these groups start calling me and say, hey, how do we start a church? And so then I started in 1995, began assessing, coaching, and training new start pastors around the country. I work with 20-some-odd different denominations, from the Pentecostals on the one end to the Anglicans on the other, and all the different tribes in between. In 1999, I got involved with the United Methodists. I don't think they knew what was coming from them, but I had some good people that I met, and we started doing that kind of thing. I began to assess and work with them. And so, really, since that time, I've done a lot of work. I actually have contracts in 51 annual conferences. I tell people my church background, Bishop, is more in the Reformed tradition, but I've been around you Methodists so long, now I'm beginning to doubt my election. But don't get too cocky, even that was predestined. So anyway, so my whole background is planting churches. I just want to at least show you my family. I've raised 5 children, I have 3 grandchildren, and for many years I was a single parent raising them, and just figured I'd be single the rest of my life. But I went down to the Florida conference here a few years back and began coaching some of their pastors, and I met a Florida elder and I got married. I married a Methodist. John Wesley preached that very famous sermon, Almost Christian. I tell people now I'm almost Methodist. She's been working on me. In fact, she tells me I'm more Wesleyan in my ecclesiology than the Methodist. So anyway, I don't know what to tell you. There we are on our honeymoon. I have 2 extra daughters, 2 stepdaughters, so we got 7 we're raising. They're all out of the home, thank God. We live in Orlando, so here's a picture of my home. We have some fantastic neighbors that we hang out with. But fortunately, That's just the way it is. Now, in 2002, I was in the Arkansas conference, and I was out to dinner with Bishop Huey and her husband Bob, who's also a Methodist elder. And at the dinner, Bishop Huey said to me, "Now, Jim, I know you're here to work with our 13 new church starts, but Bob here is just kind of an interim pastor to a declining Methodist congregation. And I wonder if you could meet with them one of the nights you're here, meet with their church council, because they're interested in how they begin to turn around their decline." Well, I looked at Bishop Huey and I said, no. No. In fact, I used the Gehenna word when I described to her, it was not good. I mean, I said, "Bishop Huey, because in Texas, they have these sayings in Texas, but now that I'm married to a Methodist pastor, I'm learning sanctified language, So I said, "Gehenna, no." And so I talked with Bishop Huey, and she kept after me, and she said, "Well, if you could just meet with them, they have a lot of concerns about their church losing members, and could you meet with them?" And I said, "No, Bishop Huey," I said, "the reason I got into church planting, I didn't want to deal with existing churches. I don't have a nurturing bone in my body. I wasn't called to pastor. I wanted to start new churches. That was the way for me, the most effective way to reach new people for the kingdom and Christ was to start new churches, and that's what I did." I said, I know what they are. They're just a bunch of, older people. All they want is the tradition, They got two kinds of instruments, organ and piano. And I said, "I don't want to meet with them. No. And I don't know. I think she gave me a couple more glasses of wine, and I finally said yes. Bishops will resort to anything. Oh, my goodness. The next night, I'm sitting in this very old United Methodist Church, and they have 34 active members. 19 of them are on the church council. You think you got problems in your church? 19. And when I say they were an elderly group, they had blue hair, not gray hair. And I said, "Well, what is it you're wanting to know?" "Well, we would like to know how to get new members. How do we get some new people in our church?" And I looked, I said, "I have no idea how an existing church gets new people." I said, "I've worked with, hundreds of United Methodist Church planters who, are appointed to an area. Back at that time, they were appointed to an area and say, get some new people." They didn't have anybody. They started a new church. I said, "I could tell you what we train them to do, but I can't tell you how to grow an existing church." And they said, "Well, what do you tell them to do?" So I began to kind of go through what I told them. And they said, "Well, we could try some of those." I said, "Well, okay, go ahead. Well, would you coach us?" "Oh, no." I started twitching. And I said, "Well, I don't think so. I don't think I'm the person to coach you. I'm not really a pastor." "Well, yes, but you have some good ideas. Would you coach us?" Well, I don't know what they slipped me, but I agreed to do that. And, I just kind of, when you have 34 people, you don't, in my Bible, you don't despise the day of small things. And so I began to work with them. They had a part-time local pastor who just needed training, really. He was very eager. And so he began to do some of the things that we trained new church planters to do. And before you know it, they had 50 active adult members. And just this last year, so that was 11 years ago, they emailed me saying that they had now just called their first full-time elder in 25 years. They have 120 active adult members. They haven't gotten any younger, friends. You know what they got? Newer. So let's be clear. We're not looking for young members. We're looking for new people. And sometimes some of you congregations ought to be focusing on the people right around, right there. So anyway, we started talking about that. But that's the kind of thing we did. And so what that happened with Bishop Huey that night opened up a door for me that I never anticipated going through, and that was working with existing churches who had been in a perpetual state of numerical decline for the last 5,000 years. So 40% of what I do now is that. In fact, actually this year, this ministry year, when I look at all the groups that I'm working with, it's probably closer to 65 or 70% of working with existing churches who are in some sort of numerical decline. When I work with them, their church councils ask me only two questions. And the first one is, how do we get new people? And the second is, how do we get more money? So I basically have two workshops and training things that we do and all of my associates do, and that is how to reach new people and how to turn tippers into tithers. And those are the two things. Because when you solve those two, when you answer those two questions in any church, 98.5% of the problems are solved. And the others you don't even worry about. And so those are the kind of things that we have going on. And the Reaching New People workshops, it's quite interesting because we know that in 1999, George Barna said 80% of all churches in the United States are in some sort of numerical decline. And what we find is that when we work with churches, that is the number one question on their mind. How do we get new people? Now, I'm not saying necessarily that their motives are good, but they want to at least get new people. And so, unfortunately, their lobbies are empty, their churches are empty, and they resort to traditional methods like the attract model. As in, here we are, you come to us. Now, that worked well back in the 1950s, but you'll recognize some of these. Oh, hey, don't you get that? And you put that up on your building, that'll get a lot of new people coming to the church. See, the traditional methods, when we work with these churches, they're still working out of a 1955 way of doing church, and all these things worked back then. You know, how about the fantasy church members that show up, where they want to serve on all the committees? They want to join the choir. They tithe. And as one pastor told me, yeah, and they also have a condo on the Gulf of Mexico that they share with their pastor. Fantasy church members. Oh, how about the latest, the bulletin, the big billboards? I had a pastor this morning asking me about, signage. I was working with a Methodist church in West Virginia. They were ready to spend $35,000 on one of those big electronic signs. And it was out on the highway, the interstate. And I said, well, what kind of messages are you putting on these signs? Well, many words on the, just kind of scrolls along. And I said, well, have you ever thought about how long someone driving 75 miles an hour, how long their eyes fixate on any one object at a time? Does anybody here know what that is? It's it's under 1 second. So they're going to spend $35,000 on a sign, as if in, driving down the interstate, look, honey, a sign, and they pull in, rush forward, and fill out a pledge card for the church. It's a lot of money. Oh, this is the one that when we work with existing churches, this is the number one thing that the membership committee or the church council says. They say to their past, well, what about, we want to grow by tracking down our inactive members. And I can only tell you that we know that it takes 10 times more energy to track down an inactive member than it does to get a brand new one. And not only that, but truth be known, when the inactive members show up, all the active members remember why they left in the first place. That gets a chuckle from them. Oh, how about this is the magic pill. What's the magic pill? How do we get new people? Friends, I'll tell you, there's no magic pills. For most of you pastors, if you're in any kind of numerical decline, pastoring a church of that, the hardest work you're going to do as a pastor is to get the next 10 adults fully assimilated into your church, following the discipleship path that John Wesley has prescribed. It'll be the hardest work you've ever done. You think cantankerous church people are hard. Trying to get new people into your church will be the hardest work you ever do, because we no longer live in 1955. And yet many pastors are still looking for the magic pill. And they always want me, Jim, how do you grow? How do we grow the church? I said, well, I can give you a very simple explanation, all right? You buy some Miracle Grow. We sell this on our website. $495 a bottle. Then you add the consultant to it. You know, you bring the consultant in, and then you end up with something like this. Now, but this is the kind of approach that we have. And pastors, I'm not insensitive or unaware of the fact that this is the kind of solutions that many of your members, the more desperate the church gets, the more they start looking for this kind of stuff. But adding new people is hard work. It's hard work. And that's the piece that I want to talk with you about a little this afternoon, just here for a few minutes. Because one of the things, I had no training in starting new churches. I just went out. They were non-denominational churches. I had no support. I had no members. I just went out and began to knock on doors. And my role was really to knock on doors, gather people together, and start a church. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. I did it 6 times only because of my pathology, not because of anything great about me. And so I would like to just kind of take a few minutes of your time this afternoon to talk about, you know, what are the things that we find about United Methodist Church planters that are adding new people that existing church pastors could benefit from. And that's really what I want to talk to you about. But I can tell you this, United Methodist Church planters know that we no longer live in 1955. And this is one of the biggest hurdles that many existing churches have, is that pastors are going into churches where the members have not understood that we still live, that we no longer live in 1955. And yet most of the methods and most of the mindsets are still of that. Ladies, here's one of my favorites right here. Oh, don't you just long for the good old days? In 1955, the block in Miami, there were 16 homes, 8 on each side. And on Sunday morning, Bishop, at 10 o'clock in the morning, there was a traffic jam on my street and any other street in Miami and any other town in this country. Because in 1955, if you were a business person and you wanted to do business in your community, you either attended a synagogue or a church, or you didn't do business. That's just the way it was back then. And that, you know, we had one family that were communists, but they went up and went somewhere else because they didn't want to be seen as godless pagans, you know, staying home. You know, so this is the world as we knew it in 1955. And it's a very unfortunate things. Now, this is a little video that you can find on YouTube. And if you're working with your church council, trying to get them into the 21st century, this might be one you want to download. Let's see if we can get that going. Some of these videos work, maybe they're not. You might need to crank the volume on this one too.
I'll always remember 1961. The space race began, the Yankees won the World Series, and that's the year the construction boom came to our neighborhood. At one end of the street, they built a church. It was huge and real traditional looking, with a great big tall steeple that you could see all over town. At the other end of the street, they built a grocery store. It was big too. I mean, it had just about everything a 10-year-old boy in 1961 could ever dream of. Well, a lot can happen in 12 years. And by the time 1973 came around, my neighborhood had changed a lot. The old grocery store was nothing like I remembered it. As a kid, you know, it had space-age food in the back and electric cash registers up front. At the other end of the street, that big traditional-looking church, well, it was pretty much the same. By 1984, pretty much everybody I knew as a kid had moved out of my neighborhood. Now, there were so many different people living there, and they spoke so many different languages. That old grocery store was certainly not what it used to be either. Now it sold all kinds of foreign food with names I couldn't even pronounce. And at the other end of the street, that church with the great big tall steeple, well, things still hadn't changed too much there. Well, my old neighborhood has never stopped changing. Today, young families are moving back in. Kids are playing up and down the street that I used to play on. And as for the grocery store, it's still changing with the neighborhood. Now it seems all you can find on the shelves is health food. I guess it's not been easy, all that change. But it seems like that old grocery store has always been willing to do it if it meant bringing in new business. As for that church at the other end of the street, well, just this last time I visited, I noticed after all these years,